Amen. Well, hey, welcome everybody. I'm glad you're here. If you've come the last couple of weeks and I am a new face to you, my name's Tony. I am the director of high school ministry here, and it's my pleasure to be with you this evening. I know if you've joined us for the last couple of weeks, we are in the middle of a series that we're doing in every ministry of Calvary, from middle school all the way up through high school, young adults, adult ministries, senior ministries, everything that we've got going on. We spend 6 weeks every fall doing the exact same curriculum. And so we obviously adapt it for high school versus like senior citizens. That's a little bit different, but we teach the same things and have the same topics. And so we're in the middle of this series that we are calling Hope for the Heavy Heart. And I know some of you maybe came into church and you were like, I felt pretty good showing up. I was pretty excited to be with my friends and I was pretty happy. And then worship, like that was good. And now we're just gonna go like straight downhill into sadness and just all like, it's gonna be a heavy night. My hope is that that's not actually the case. My hope is that we address real things tonight. We address real things that are going on, but we aren't gonna stay there. Because our God isn't a God of just sadness, isn't a God of just discouragement, isn't a God who lets us sit in those things forever and ever. My hope is that we can really understand that when sadness and discouragement shows up in our lives, that that's not something that's final, that that's not something that's gonna take over our lives forever, that if you're feeling discouraged right now, you're not gonna feel discouraged for the rest of your life, and it's just gonna be miserable, and then someday you're like gonna kind of barely make it to heaven, and then things are gonna be okay. My hope for tonight is that we get a clearer picture of what sadness and what discouragement means for us right now, what that might mean to wrestle with that in your lives, because I know if you're anything like me, we've been through a season that's been tough, and it's been sad, it's been discouraging at times. I know there have probably been times where myself or some other adult came up to you at service or a high school event, and we're like, hey, can you put your mask on? And you're like, I don't want to put my mask on. I want to like rip your face off and then find somebody nicer to hang out with. Like, I know it's been a frustrating, discouraging season for all of us. But my hope is that we leave tonight with a better understanding of that, yeah, we might still be in this season. We might still be in this season with COVID, with everything going on with that. And maybe personally, this has been a tough season for you, and there's been stuff going on with your family or your friends or things that I don't even know that are going on in your lives. But what I do know is that the same God that you know is the same God I know. And when we dive into his word, we can really see what he has to say about these things. And so just before we, or actually, if you've got your Bibles or your phones, you can go ahead and open those up to the book of Job. This sermon, we're going to kind of jump around in the book of Job, but I'm going to try to give you references as we go through it, as to what chapter and what verse you can look for. But before we get into the text, I want to just put up a slide that we've had each and every week. Basically, if you need somebody to talk to, whether that's talking to about stuff going on in your life, if something in one of the sermons just hits you and you're like, I really need to talk to just a safe person. Maybe you just want somebody who you can talk to that's able to sit and listen to you, or if there's something going on outside of HSM and it has nothing to do with that, or just like questions about faith or really anything, just text HSM Talk to 818-405-8445. For you guys in the back, I'll just put that number up one more time. So it's HSM Talk to 818-405-8445. That's just basically a number that we've set up. If you text that number, either Britt or myself will reach out to you and just say, hey, what questions do you have? What can we help with? And it's not like if you fill this out, we're not going to call you and be like, what's your deepest, darkest sin? Tell me now. Like that's not what this is set up for. This is set up just as a space for you to say, hey, I want to talk to somebody about something going on, or I have questions. Just text HSM Talk to that number, and we'll reach out to you sometime this week. So that's that, just as we get started. And then one other thing before we dive into the text. I'm a preacher. I'm a pastor. I am not a therapist. And there's a distinction there, because as we get into talking about sadness and discouragement tonight, the one word that I'm going to try really hard not to use is depression. And that's not because that's something that I'm trying to push off to the side. That's not something that I take lightly, but it's something that I never want to misuse. I never want to mistake my own sadness for depression, because what that does is when I say, oh, I am so depressed right now, but I'm not actually struggling with depression, is that minimizes the struggle of those who actually struggle with clinical depression. And so what I will say is this, is if you're here and you feel like you're struggling with depression, or you feel like that's something that's just been gnawing at you, or maybe that's part of your past. And anytime we talk about sadness or depression or anxiety, that brings stuff up in you, either come talk to us after or go find somebody, go find a counselor or a therapist who can help, because I don't want to pretend to be something that I'm not. That would make me a hypocrite. I don't want to give you advice that I shouldn't be giving you because I'm not trained in that area. But what I can do is say, hey, here's the word of God. And then God has also provided resources for you to go get help. And there's no shame in that. There is no shame in going and saying, hey, I'm struggling with depression right now. I need to get help. And God has placed men and women in those careers where they can help you. That's what they do for a living. And so my plea for you is, if that's what you're struggling with, and similarly, I know last week talking about anxiousness and anxiety, if anxiety is something you struggle with, go get help from somebody for that, because we want you to be healthy, both spiritually and emotionally and physically, but we're here to care for kind of the spiritual aspect of that. But there are people who are trained and who are professionals to help with anxiety, to help with depression, to help with those things. So does that sound good? Cool. I know that's like super heavy start, but with that, go ahead and open up to the book of Job. And as you do, you can start kind of just cruising through the first chapter, but really what Job is all about. It's this book in the Old Testament. It's about halfway through the Old Testament. So if you open up your Bible, basically go like a third of the way in and then just kind of flip around for your pages to find Job. It's right in the Old Testament, which means it took place before Jesus was alive. And this book is actually, something to know about the Bible is the Bible isn't put together from like oldest book to newest book. And so it's known that Job may actually be the oldest book in the Bible, or it's one of the oldest books in the Bible. So this goes way, way back in the history of God's people. And what Job ultimately teaches us is how to deal with sadness, is how to deal with things when they're not going your way, how to deal with the tough parts of life that we don't really want to deal with, how to really just look to God in the midst of everything that's going on. Because I think for us, we live in a culture right now that we don't deal with sadness well. And what I mean by that, when we're sad or we're discouraged, I don't think that we deal with this particularly well. And I've got a couple of examples. Really, I just sat down and I was like, let's think about my own life. When I'm sad, what do I do? And they're actually not really that constructive. And the first one, the first way I deal with sadness sometimes is the sad music spiral. Now, I asked a few of you if you were here as part of the band or adult leaders. I was like, okay, so here's a scenario. Your boyfriend or girlfriend just broke up with you and you're in the car driving home. Like, what song do you put on? And nobody's like, oh, I'm gonna put on some like happy feel-good song. Everybody's like, oh, I'm gonna put on this like Adele ballad of like, I hope I find someone like you, and you're just bawling your eyes out. And then you go home and you start the like rom-com marathon and you're like, oh, everybody found love except for me. And then what happens? You get in your car, you listen to the sad music, and then you just feel worse about yourself. And then you go watch the sad rom-coms, and do you feel better after you sit and watch 8 hours of other people finding love, and you're like, oh no, not me, and you feel worse. So then what do? You go to your room, and you crank on the sad music, and you like cry yourself to sleep. I'm not trying to be insensitive, I'm sorry, but it's really just what we do. Like, it's what happens because something in us says, oh, this might make me feel better if I could just let it out. And it's like, okay, you kind of got it, but most of the time, you're really just throwing a pity party for yourself. You listen to the sad music and you watch these sad movies and it doesn't actually help. And so you're dealing with sadness in a way that's not actually gonna bring you out of that sadness. So that's the first one. That's the first way that I think some of us deal with being sad. The second one, I like to call it the implosion spiral. And this comes from you being really sad. So imagine like you're in the car ride on the way home and some of you may turn on the sad music, but maybe you're the person who gets in the car and you start calling your friends. You're like, hey, so-and-so and I just broke up, but I'm fine. Everything's fine. Like I'm good. I'm doing better. And they're like, no, how are you really? Are you okay? And you're like, no, I'm fine. I'm good. Never been better. Everything's fine. And you show up to school the next day and you like run into that person. And then you're like, hey, how's it going? I'm doing great. How are you? And you're convinced everything's fine and you never actually address the fact that you're sad. And maybe you go to small group and you're doing highs and lows of the week. We call them life updates of like, hey, what's going on in your life? You're like, oh, everything's great. Everything's fine. But the reason I call it the implosion spiral is that at some point, you're just fed up with saying, I'm fine. And it all just comes out. Like you're doing good for maybe it's a few days or maybe it's a few weeks, but at some point you just break down. Because this spiral gets you so deep into, okay, I'm sad, but I'm gonna try to bury it. And then I start to feel sad and I'm gonna bury it. And I feel sad and I'm gonna bury it. And you have so much baggage buried in your heart that you haven't dealt with that at some point it just explodes, but you don't actually feel better after. You don't actually feel better. So I see those as two of the ways that people deal with sadness. The third one, I call this the unhelpful friends spiral. Where some of you are actually pretty good about you're sad and you go to friends for help, but you don't actually go to the right friends. What I mean is maybe you just got broken up with and you go to the friends that you're like, hey, can you help me through this? Like, I'm really sad, I'm really struggling. And they just always agree with you. And they're like, yeah, he's the worst. We hate him. And they were like best friends with him like 2 days before you broke up. And they're like, oh yeah, you have every right to be sad. And that's fine at first, but then it's like 6 weeks later and you're still going to those friends asking for justification of like, I'm still so sad. And they're like, yeah, you can be as sad as long as you want to. Like, and they don't actually offer help. Like, I'm not talking about going to people who aren't empathetic. There's a piece to that of like, go to your friends and they'll help like sit with you in what's going on. But if 6 months have gone by and you're not around people who are helping you move forward, you're stuck in this unhelpful friend spiral. And what happens with that is you get problems that are kind of half resolved, that you never actually get closure with things that have happened because you're surrounding yourself with people who aren't actually letting you get closure. Or maybe there's people that have kind of convinced you that it's your fault. This is the really toxic thing of you do something and you go to people for help because you're like, oh, I'm so sad. I feel so guilty. I'm so discouraged and what's going on? And they're like, well, did you bring this on yourself? Was this something that you caused? Like, what did you do? I think this happens with siblings a lot, or like your parents. If you've done something and you try to frame your sibling and you go to your parents and they're like, oh, they did this to me. And your parents are like, well, what did you do? And I'm not like, that's a whole different story. But you know what I'm saying with people who are just like, they kind of turn it on you. There's unhelpful friends or unhelpful people that you go to when you're sad. It doesn't actually help you resolve your sadness. And the fourth one, and this is actually a really dangerous one to fall into, but it's the coping method spiral. And I think this is one that can take a lot of different forms, where you're sad and you just want something to mask that sadness. And maybe for you that's drugs or that's alcohol, where it's just, I'm overwhelmed with this sadness, and so I'm gonna try to escape it with alcohol or with drugs or with things that are just gonna make me not feel for a few hours. But that could also look like unhealthy eating. Of every time you're sad, you just start going and eating as much junk food as you can, and that's just kind of your coping method because that's what you do, or binge watching Netflix or whatever it is, spending hours and hours on TikTok, like whatever that coping method is. But you see what happens with that is, again, it's just a way to mask the sadness, not a way to actually work through it. It's you saying, look, this is where I'm at, but I'm not actually taking steps to try to work through this or even try to confront the fact that I'm sad. I'm just trying to mask it. Because you see, if you're sad or if you're discouraged about something, each one of these spirals takes you to a place where you're not actually trying to fix problems. You're just trying to put little Band-Aids on your heart, and you're feeling a certain way, but you're trying to convince yourself that you're okay, or you're trying to just say, if I could only be okay for a little bit, then maybe everything will be all right. And it's so sad to me to see this. It's so sad to see and to hear about people who have gone through one or more of these spirals when you're sad, and then you wind up in my office and you're like, I don't know why, I'm still struggling. And I think it starts with this, of each one of these spirals, each one of these things that happen, that you might get caught in, whether it's the sad music spiral or a coping method or friends or whatever it is, and you don't actually get closure on it. The problem with all of these ways of dealing with sadness is actually that the focus in each one of them is just on you and how you feel. It's not actually on your sadness. It's not actually on the discouragement. It's saying, what is going to make me feel good in this moment? What's going to make me feel justified in this moment? What's going to make me feel okay in this moment? The focus is on you. But you see, the only way to actually work through these things is to take the perspective that Job ultimately takes, and we're going to get into the text here, but it is to take the the hard look at your own heart and say, I'm sad right now. I'm discouraged right now. And I also know that when I'm sad and I'm discouraged, I become irrational. Like, I think for me, it's taking that step and saying, look, okay, when I'm sad, I'm not thinking straight. When I'm discouraged, I'm not thinking straight. When these things are going on in my life, I'm actually not thinking straight. So the way that I'm going to get through it isn't just to do whatever my desires say to do in that moment. Because you see, dealing with discouragement takes discipline. It takes the discipline of saying, look, I know that I'm sad right now, and I'm recognizing that. And the first step to helping me work through this is actually taking the discipline to say, okay, I'm going to take a step back, and I'm going to see what's actually going to help me. What's actually going to help me get through this, not just put a Band-Aid on my heart for the next day or the next couple hours or the next week. That I'm actually going to look inside my heart and have the discipline to go to God in prayer for this. I'm actually going to have the discipline to go spend time with Jesus. I'm actually going to have the discipline to take the focus off of myself and put it on God when I'm sad. And you see, what happens in the book of Job is there's this guy named Job. That's what the book is named after. But the whole premise of the book is basically this is this guy who has everything. Like, he's really just well off. Actually, we'll read this from chapter 1 in Job. This is how the book starts off, starting in 1:1. It says, in the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, and 500 donkeys, and had a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. Like, I kind of got caught up in the thousands of sheep and donkeys and camels and whatever he's got. I was like, that could fill up the whole Santa Monica Mountains. So think about it, like, this dude had everything. He was really well off. He was wealthy. He was a good person. He was successful. He was God-fearing, God-loving. Like, basically, this book starts off of saying, look, Job was this person who would be an example to everybody else around him. He was like the good person who had it all together. And what I want us to see is, as we get into this story, I think that the way that you view yourself is probably very similar to the way that Job is portrayed here. He was wealthy. He was well off. We live in Westlake. We live in Southern California. I don't care where you live in Southern California. Compared to the majority of the world, you are unbelievably wealthy. Knowing just a lot of you, I think you'd call yourself a good person. You understand that, okay, we're all sinners and we're saved by grace, but if I really came down to it and was like, don't give me the Jesus answer, do you think you're a good person or not? I think that you would internally be like, yeah, I'm a mostly good person. You're all successful. The majority of people in this world don't get past middle school, don't get past 7th, 8th grade. You all have passed 7th, 8th grade. Congratulations. You are successful. And you're here, which means you at least have some sort of interest in God. Many of you, I know, are God-loving people, God-fearing people. You spend time with Jesus. You spend time in prayer and reading the Bible. You're at small group. You're at all these things because you love God. And you see what happens here is they set up this story of Job because Job was the same way. Job was this person who you would be like, oh, that guy's got everything. And then what happens is in the story, there's God and there's Satan and there's Job. And so Job is this guy who's kind of got everything together, and then God basically says, hey, Satan, you can do whatever you want to Job because he's not going to renounce his faith in me. He's not going to get mad at me. He's not going to say, he's not going to denounce my name and say, I'm not following God anymore. He's like, basically like, do your worst because Job is faithful. And that might sound strange to you. That might sound weird to you of like, well, why would God do that? But if you think about it in our lives, there are many of you who have gone through things that are harder than I have ever gone through, but you're here. There are things that you've gone through that I couldn't imagine, but you're here because you love God and you know that ultimately it ends in victory for you. And Job knew the same thing of, look, no matter what happens to me in this world, I know that my story ends in victory, not because of who I am, but because of what God has done, because of who God is. And so when God says, Satan, go ahead and do your worst, basically he says, look, go ahead and attack him in this world because, yeah, this world might be yours, but ultimately Job's going to be with me. And I win and he wins. So then what happens? God says, okay, go ahead, Satan, you can attack Job. You can do whatever you want. Just don't kill him. Satan then goes and takes all of Job's stuff. Like, this is the summary of the first couple chapters of Job. It's a really rough book. Satan goes and like takes everything away from Job, winds up like killing his sons and taking all of his like thousands of sheep and oxen and everything away. And this is just like the low point, so I put it on here. Like I think it's in chapter 3, Job's wife actually tells him to curse God and commit suicide. Like, it's intense. She's like, what happened? God is making your life miserable. Why don't you just like curse him and say, God, what are you doing? Like, I don't trust you, I don't follow you anymore, and then die. Like, I think that's actually what she says. She's like, curse God and die. That's his wife. That wasn't like some weirdo on the street. That was his wife being like, yeah, curse God and die. Your life's awful. That's a whole nother thing. Like that, I can't even understand that. But basically what happens is Satan takes everything away from Job. In the first few chapters, the first few books. And this is where Job gets to. In the midst of his discouragement, in the midst of his sadness, like none of this was easy for him. None of this was something that he would have expected to happen. None of these were things that he expected to have to deal with. And then all of a sudden, they were there in his life, and he didn't know why. But it says this in chapter 1, verse 22. But through all this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. This, to me, is just incredible to see, because I think for us, a lot of times we like to praise God when things are going well, but then we like to blame God when things are going poorly. We say, okay, God, when everything's going well in my life, like it's easy to give you the praise. When the acceptance letter comes in for college, okay, I'll give you the praise for that. But then when things don't go my way, I'm going to say, God, why didn't you let me into that college? Why didn't you let that guy or that girl ask me to the dance? Why didn't you fix things with my family? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Why didn't you show up in this way? We like to blame God because when we can't understand things, that's our default of like, oh, this could never be my fault. But maybe God is out there trying to get me. Maybe he's out there trying to make things hard on me for whatever reason. I don't know. But we start blaming God. You see, he says through this, Job did not sin, nor did he blame God. And I love, this is actually the verse right before chapter 1, verse 22. This is actually the words of Job. Basically, how did he do this? How did he choose not to blame God? How did he not sin in the middle of this? How, when things were going so poorly for him, how did he have the perspective to actually say, okay, I'm sad, I'm discouraged, but I'm going to deal with this. And I'm going to walk through this. Like, I know God's going to bring me through this. How was he able to keep that perspective? He says this in chapter 1, verse 21. He says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. And this first part of the verse is spoken in really kind of old English, like the naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return naked shall I return. Like, what does that mean? But this is actually a really beautiful thing that he's saying. He's like, look, I came into this world, like every baby comes into this world. They don't own stuff. They don't have clothes. They don't have a house. They don't have a significant other. They don't have a school that they go to. They don't have friends. They don't have all the stuff that as you grow older, you start to accumulate and you start to have. And you start to have these experiences. Babies don't have these experiences. And what he's saying is, look, that's how I was brought into this world. So really what God has given me, he's given me life, he's given me breath, and everything else that he's given me is his. And he says, naked shall I return. The Lord gave and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Every time I read this, we don't have time to go through the whole book of Job, but I remember when I was in college, it was like a 15-week Bible study on the book of Job, and I really encourage you to go read it if you're struggling, especially if you're struggling with sadness or depression or discouragement. Read this book. Because this perspective that he has, where he says, look, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away, blessed be the name of the Lord, is one of the most challenging verses in the whole Bible for me. It's one of the things that I just wrestle with because my heart and my soul and everything in me wants to say the same thing if that were to happen to me. If God were to take everything away from me, I would love to say, without a shadow of a doubt, I would say, blessed be the name of the Lord, because he gave me all these things in the first place. And I wrestle with it, and I struggle with it. Like, I know I talk about this every time I'm up here, but I have the most amazing wife in the world, and I am so blessed to be with her, and I can't imagine if something happened to her. Would I be able to sit there and say, the Lord gave and the Lord has taken away? Blessed be the name of the Lord. And I know that so many of you have been in situations like that, whether it was a family member dying, or a friend dying, or health, or just things going on in your life, whatever it is that is the most important thing to you right now. If God were to take that away, would you still be able to say, blessed be the name of the Lord? And if not, why not? You see, that's where we're able to step away from sadness and discouragement and say, I'm sad and I'm discouraged and I don't know what to do. If we can get to this point of saying, okay, I'm going to shift my perspective. Because then all of a sudden when I'm driving home from that breakup or from whatever like that thing is that just happened, and I can say, wow, that was never actually mine in the first place. That was a gift from God that he let me borrow for a time, but it's not mine forever, it's God's. And so he's given and now he's taken it away. And I don't know why, but blessed be the name of the Lord. You see, if we could get there, if we could get to that place where then when COVID hit in March, we would have been able to deal better with our frustration and our discouragement when things started getting canceled, when things didn't work out the way that you thought they would, when summer plans got messed up and summer camp didn't happen and family trips and all of those things. Imagine if through all of it, you had the perspective of just the Lord gave. He gave those plans. He made those things happen in the past, but then the Lord, he took them away. And I don't know why, but blessed be the name of the Lord. You see, this is where Job was getting to. He said, look, and this was all in chapter 1. He's like, look, the Lord gave and the Lord takes away. Blessed be his name. And the book of Job has over 40 chapters. And so this was like just the very beginning. And so this is like mile 1 of the marathon. And he's like, look, I'm still strong. I'm holding on. Blessed be the name of the Lord. But you see that the book doesn't stop there. Job was still tempted. And basically chapters 4 through 37 of this book is Job being tempted from different things where basically Satan keeps going. He keeps taking things away. He keeps making Job's life miserable. He keeps just going. And basically here's what happens in a nutshell. Job's friends show up in the story. He's got these 3 friends and they give him tons of bad advice. And they kind of go back and forth. And one friend is basically like, you brought this on yourself. Like, what sin did you commit? Like, this is really scary stuff of like, if I was up here telling you like, oh, whatever's a mess in your life right now is something that you caused. And if you just did better, then maybe that thing would go away. I'd be like the worst preacher ever. Like, I'd be the biggest heretic ever. That is not true at all. But Job's friends are basically like, look, you brought this on yourself. You did this. You need to repent. You need to change, and then maybe things will get better. They try to blame his sufferings on his personal sins rather than God testing and growing Job. One of them was, he's kind of half correct in that God wanted to humble Job. Like that God allows things to happen in our lives sometimes to humble us, but it was only a part of God's test. And so this actually goes back to that unhelpful friends spiral that I was talking about earlier. That Job was surrounded by these people who actually didn't have his best interest in mind. They were actually these friends, and maybe they did. That's not fair of me to judge, but they were these people who weren't actually helping him grow closer to God. They had all their own opinions on why Job was dealing with what he was dealing with, and they all had the right answer. They all had their kind of reasons for, oh, Job, if you did this or you did that, you could fix yourself. Or if you try this essential oil, or if you try this acupuncture treatment, or if you try like this meditation, you're going to be fixed. All these things they thought might be good, but actually didn't do anything to help Job. But you see, if he had listened to him, imagine this. If Job had listened to his friends who were saying, oh, what personal sin did you commit? He would have started down this spiral that wouldn't have helped him, but would have brought him deeper into sadness, would have brought him deeper into discouragement, that wouldn't have actually helped anything going on in his life. Had he listened to those friends who weren't actually seeking God's counsel, he never would have actually gotten closure with what was happening. He would have just constantly been asking, like, well, what do I do to fix this? and he'd try something and it wouldn't work. What do I do to fix this? He'd try something and it wouldn't work. So you see, his friends come in and they try to give him all this advice, but it isn't really helpful. And so he kind of gets through that in chapter 37. I'm basically summarizing like 100 pages of the Bible right now, but this is the story of Job. And then what happens is we talked about basically the friends spiral, but then this implosion spiral kind of shows up. And so Job gets through these 37 chapters of his life, however many years that was. And then he gets to this point where he's talking with God. All of a sudden, basically, God comes up to him and they're talking, and Job is basically just pouring out his heart. And it says God speaks to Job and restores him. Like, God knows that Job has received incorrect guidance from his friends. Like, God gets it. He's like, look, those people haven't been helpful to you. And then he declares that humans don't know everything. I love this. This is, imagine Job and God just sitting there. Or imagine you and God just sitting there and you're telling him about that thing that happened to you. And all those friends that were trying to say, oh, well, it was your fault. Oh, you shouldn't have been at that party. Oh, you shouldn't have been there. Oh, you shouldn't have done this or this. And then this wouldn't have happened to you. And it's just you and God sitting there. And God's like, look, yeah, all those people who have been telling you these things, yeah, they don't know everything. They don't have all the right answers. Like how freeing that would have been. But then God goes into basically interrogation mode with Job because Job's frustrated. He's like, God, what is happening? What's going on? Why is this happening to me? And God says this, he starts asking all of these questions that nobody other than him could answer. And I love this section because what happens is God asks all these questions and they basically are around this one question. It's, where were you? God goes and asks Job basically like, where were you when I formed the earth? Where were you when I separated the light from the darkness? Where were you when I decided that the oceans and the land were going to be split? Where were you when I created the coastlines and I created your human race? Where were you when all of these things happened? Just like lights into Job. And if you go anywhere through, I believe it's chapter 38 through 42. Just like scroll through that if you're on your Bible or open to that on your phone and just read a few of the questions. It's unbelievable. Like imagine God coming to you and you're talking about your problems and what's going on. And he's like, yeah, okay, yeah, those people who are trying to help you don't know everything, but who are you to question me? Who are you to say these things that are happening to you are unjust or not part of my plan? Because where were you when I formed this world? Like if I could do that, why are you telling me how to run your life? Why are you telling me what's good and what's not? Why are you telling me these things? Don't you believe that if I created everything, I have what's best for you in mind? And it's this beautiful, humbling part of the book that I look at this as kind of Job's implosion spiral of he's trying to say like, I'm fine, I'm good, blessed be the name of the Lord, but he's still struggling inside. He's still struggling and it kind of implodes. And he's like, God, what are you doing? And God takes it. God isn't afraid of it. He's not afraid of your feelings. He's not afraid of your emotions. He's not afraid of your anger. Like I think about this one time, it was actually my senior year of high school. And some of you who know a little bit of my story know that basically sports were kind of my life in high school. I got injured my junior year. I started to just like have some things wrong with my leg and I started limping around. And then beginning of senior year, I had a hip surgery. And then I wound up like interning with the church, all these different things. But while I was recovering, I had this moment where I remember part of my job interning at the church was I would set out chairs for Sunday service. We'd have like 400 chairs that we'd set out in this auditorium, and it was a school auditorium, and so we'd have to like pull all the chairs and then set them all out. And guess who got to do that? That was my job. And we had like, it was this high-tech thing. We had like this string, and it was marked off every few feet, and so you had to set the chairs up just right. And I remember reaching for this stack of chairs and just feeling my hip pop. And in that moment, I was like 3 months into recovery from my surgery, and I was the only one in this auditorium. It was like a Friday night at church, and I was the only one there. And I remember I'd had it. I just started screaming at God. And I remember what I said. I said, God, I know you have a plan in this, but I don't understand what it is. So please show me. And it was this moment that nobody else experienced. Nobody else was there. There wasn't like some sad janitor that walked in and saw some crazy person yelling at God. It was just me. But I sat there and I started crying and I was like, God, what is happening? I thought that this was the plan you had for me. I thought I was going to go here and do this for you and do that. And you're just tearing all of it apart. What's happening? But you see what happened is God met me. Not in that moment. I remember screaming and crying and yelling at God and looking crazy. And then it just kind of passed. And I got in my car and I drove home. And I didn't feel better in that moment. There wasn't like some angel that showed up and said, hey, everything's going to be okay. But I do remember the next few months, God started to put together a new plan for me. And that new plan was very different than what I had originally thought. Like if I had my plan my way, I'd be out in like snowy East Coast somewhere and like the other coast at some other school. I would have never been here. I would have never met my wife. I would have never done so many things that God had in store for me. But when I was questioning him, he's like, no, just chill out for a second. Let me work my plan out in your life. Let me work my plan out in your life. And trust me, you can be sad, you can be discouraged, but you can't stay sad, you can't stay discouraged. And you see what happens with Job here is when he just kind of explodes and God has that moment and it's like, look, what are you doing? And all these questions, God isn't trying to just say, hey, God isn't trying to just tell him he's dumb and who's he to question God? God's comforting him and saying, look, where were you when I created the earth? Don't you understand that I have a plan for you? Where were you when I separated the seas from the land? If I could do that, I can take care of you. Where were you when I put this world together? Don't you understand that I knit each piece of it together perfectly? And that includes everybody here. That includes you. That includes your friends. That includes everything that's happened to you. You see, when you think about it that way, that's God's mercy and that's God's grace. And even Job's lowest moment where he just explodes on God, God says, look, I'm here. I'm challenging you, but I'm here. I'm putting you in your place, but I'm here. I'm with you. And so you see, he asks Job all of these questions. And then the rest of the story, you can read through it, but basically God says to Job in the end, before we even get to the end of the story, Job says this after God just like berates him with questions. He says, I have declared that which I did not understand. And basically what he's saying, he's like, you're God and I'm not. Like you're God and I'm not, so I'm trusting you. I'm with you. I'm still not going to denounce your name. I'm still not going to give up. I'm still not going to give in to my sadness, but I trust you. So you see, there's some things. Then what happens at the end of the story is Job actually winds up, God blesses him with like twice as much stuff and twice as many thousand sheep and cows and camels and whatever else in that story. And that's the way that the story ends, is God says, look, you were faithful in this moment. You were faithful at your lowest moment and your saddest moment. So here, I'm going to give you plenty. And I want to give a kind of disclaimer here, is that's how it ended for Job, but that's not guaranteed how it's ended for you. Like, I'm not preaching some prosperity gospel saying, if you're just sad and discouraged and you pray to God, like, God, would you help me get through this breakup? He's not going to have, like, Channing Tatum walk through the door the next day and sweep you off your feet. That's not how it's going to work. But what I am saying is that if it's not good, that means that God's not done yet. If it's not good, if things are still a struggle, if things are still, like, you're still sad, you're still discouraged, there's stuff going on in your life, that means God's not done. Because at Job's lowest point, God was still there. And then in Job's highest mountaintop, God was there. Because God looked at him, he said, look, I'm not a God of defeat. Just because you're down right now, it doesn't mean that you've been defeated. It doesn't mean Satan wins. It doesn't mean that just because you're discouraged because you've fallen this many times, it doesn't mean that you can't get back up. He's like, just because things aren't good right now, that means that I'm not done yet. And the beauty for Christians is that, yeah, okay, it might sound good, like today's equivalent of Job getting twice as much stuff as he had before God put him through all of this. That might sound like, okay, then you've got a mansion over in Sherwood, and you've got a mansion in Miami, and you've got like a Europe cabin that you can fly to in your private jet, and you've got all of these like physical possessions. Like, that would be kind of the modern day equivalent. But the reality is it's so much better than that, because God doesn't just say, look, in this life you're going to have stuff. The reality is God says, look, Just keep going. Keep dealing with this sadness. Keep dealing with this discouragement. Work through it, because ultimately you get to spend eternity with me in a heaven that you can't even comprehend. Like, just like he's asking Job these questions of like, where were you when the earth was formed? Where were you when this happened? Where were you when the human race was formed? Like, where were you with these things? These things that only God could know and Job couldn't understand. We can't even begin to understand what heaven's gonna be like. Like, everything in this life that is good is still not perfect. It's still so far from perfect. And heaven is like this perfect place that God has prepared for him to be with you and with me forever. And if you're a Christian, that's the reality. That's the perspective that we need to have. That's the way that we can break free from that loop of sadness and coping methods and sadness and sad music and sadness and all of these things that are dragging us down. Is we say, look, I'm sad right now, but I'm not gonna be sad forever. It might feel like forever because, trust me, 3 days can sometimes feel like forever. 6 weeks can sometimes feel like forever. 2 years can sometimes feel like forever, but it's not. You're gonna look back on these times someday and say, wow, I'm so glad God brought me through that. I'm so glad that I could see God's plan now, even if I couldn't see it then. I know that he's shown up in my life. And so the things we can take out of the book of Job, basically how he deals with his sadness is, this is you gotta admit that you're discouraged. You gotta admit that stuff isn't all right in your life, because if you just keep saying that you're fine, if you just keep saying that everything's good, everything's all right, you're never gonna actually be able to address those things in your heart. And you're gonna wind up on that kind of implosion spiral of at some point it's all gonna come out. But it's so much better to just admit that you're discouraged, because then you can ask for help from people who can help you. Then you gotta ask yourself why you're discouraged. Like, I think sometimes we walk around and you're just like in a mood and you're just like, I'm sad or I'm frustrated or I'm angry or whatever, but I don't really know why. And sometimes it's as simple as, I haven't eaten in 6 hours and I'm hungry, and that fixes everything. Well, once COVID's over, we can start having snacks. So if you show up to church like that, you can just go get snacks and feel better. But you gotta ask why you're discouraged, and if it's something like that, or if there's some big things going on in your life. You can get to the root of it and say, okay, actually, what am I wrestling through? What am I dealing with? Because you can't fix a problem if you don't know what the problem is. You can't start feeling better unless you understand why you're feeling down. See, ask why you're discouraged, and then ask or seek counsel from people for perspective. And this might sound counterintuitive, because I know in the book of Job, he goes to his friends and they're not helpful. But this is important, to seek counsel for perspective, not for judgment. And I think this actually goes both ways. The example I used for you and your friends earlier, if you go to your friends and they just agree with you in everything, that's not actually giving you perspective. That's just agreeing with you. But if you were to go to your friends and say, hey, this is what I'm wrestling with, this is why I'm sad, can you help me work through this? Your friends will probably have a mix of like, hey, I'm here for you. I'm with you for as long as it takes. I'm here to help walk you through this, but here are the things that need to change. You know, I'm gonna go ahead and block your Netflix account for the next 2 weeks so that you can't go binge watch TV shows, because that's not healthy. Hey, I'm gonna come pick you up and we're gonna go to a coffee shop somewhere and sit and hang out, because I know that when you're alone and you're sad, you might do something that you regret. There's that accountability that comes with that perspective that those friends can give you. And so I see a bunch of you here that have those kinds of friends. Seek them out. It might even be you saying, because I know it's awkward if you're one of the friends, like if you had a friend come to you and they're crying and they're just like a mess. And for you to be like, hey, I'm here for you, but I'm also like, you know, let's go to a coffee shop and talk, because when you're alone, you're gonna make bad decisions. They're like, I don't make bad decisions. I'm perfect. Because if you're the friend, you're kind of worried about that. So it might be on you, if you're the one that's sad, if you're the one who's discouraged, to say to your friend, hey, I know that I have these self-destructive tendencies when I'm sad. You might have to have the maturity to say that. So I need you to help me in these ways. I need you to be there for me and ask me how I'm doing, but then also help watch out for these things, because if I start not answering texts, or if I'm alone late at night, or if I have access to certain things, or if I'm like whatever it is, you have to let them know how they can help you, because nobody knows you better than you. And so if you're sad and you're discouraged, that's how people can help you through it. And then lastly, you got to go to God with a humble heart. Because as long as your heart is not humble or has not been humbled, you're never going to be convinced that it's your fault. You're never going to be convinced that you can actually deal with this sadness. You're never going to be convinced that your reality is actually being discouraged right now. As long as you don't have a humble heart, you're always going to play that victim mentality. And if you're a victim, sometimes you're going to be a victim all the time, and you're not actually going to work through these things in your life. But when you go to God with a humble heart, you say, God, help me. I wasn't there when the earth was formed. I don't know why these things are happening to me. I don't know what's going on, but I know that you're with me. And so I'm going to have the humility to ask you for help. Show me what your plan is. Saying, God, I don't want to keep telling you what my plan is and hope that you agree with me. What do you have for me? Even if that's difficult, even if that's tough right now, because I know that ultimately you're going to win and I'm going to win because I'm on your side. To have the humility to say, okay, God, your will, not mine. See, I'm going to invite the band back up, and as we get ready to close, I just want to encourage you with this. I know that this was a heavy topic, a heavy thing to talk about. I know that it's something that we don't like to talk about. We don't like to admit when things are not okay. We don't like to tell people when things aren't good because you feel like maybe your friends will look differently at you, or people won't understand, or they're just not really there. They say you're there, but maybe friends have bailed on you before. But what we can take out of the story of Job is the same thing that we can take out of each one of your lives, is that there is a God who has always been there for you, who is there with you, and who is going to hold your hand all the way through this life into victory. Because even though things might be tough right now, even though you might be discouraged right now or sad right now, God's giving you an opportunity to use that, to work, to let his plan be worked in your life, even in the midst of that sadness, even in the midst of that discouragement, of everything going on. You can say, okay, God, this is where I'm at, but I want to be at this place where I'm looking at the finish line and I can see you. I can see your plan. I can see eternity with you, and so help me get there. Because even when you don't think you can take another step, even when you don't think you can go another day, even if that sadness and that discouragement has you feeling like there's nowhere to go from here, there's a God that says, if it's not good, I'm not done. He's saying that over your life right now. If it's not good, I'm not done. And that's not some prosperity gospel. That's not me trying to put attributes on God that aren't actually true. It's saying that we have a creator who's created a perfect plan for each and every one of our lives. It's not an easy plan. He never promises it's going to be easy. Job's life definitely wasn't easy. He went through more heartache and more pain than I pray anybody here ever has to go through. But what God does promise is that he's there. Just like he was there for Job, he's there for you. He's there for me. When his plan doesn't make sense, we can lean on him and rest and say, okay, God, I don't need it to make sense. I just need to know you. I don't need everything in my life to make sense, because even though things might not be good and they don't make sense right now, I know that ultimately they will. Whether that's on this side of eternity or on the other side. I'm going to trust you each and every step of the way. Let me pray. Lord Jesus, thank you for tonight. Thank you for the truth of your word. Thank you for the story of Job. That's also the story of us. That's the story of anybody who's ever been discouraged or anybody who's ever been downtrodden or downcast. God, I thank you that that's the story that you're writing in each one of our lives, but that story isn't done yet. God, I pray that everything from COVID to the way that we're doing service right now, to the way that they're doing school right now, to everything that's going on in our world, even when it doesn't make sense to us and we may feel discouraged, I pray that you would give us the courage to just press on one more day, knowing that if it's not good, you're not done yet. Jesus, we know if it's not good, you're not done yet. Lord, would you impress that on our hearts? Would you never let us forget that? And as we enter into this time of worship, would that truth just ring in our hearts? Would we remember that? Because that's who you are, Jesus. We love you. We trust you. And it's in your name we pray. Amen.